Sometimes the people who smile the calmest are the ones carrying the heaviest humiliation. The shaky phone footage began with screaming in the background and the sound of hurried footsteps echoing across the crowded downtown plaza in Baltimore. People stopped walking. Some pulled out their phones. Others simply stared. In the center of it all was a black woman on her knees beside a marble fountain. Her purse spilled open across the concrete, while two police officers stood over her like she was some kind of dangerous criminal. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Officer Ryan Keller barked loudly enough for half the block to hear. His voice carried the kind of authority that expected obedience without question. Naomi Carter slowly lifted her trembling hands, her dark curls slightly covering her face as cold autumn wind swept through the plaza. She wore a long navy coat and low heels, the kind of outfit that blended professionalism with quiet elegance. But none of that mattered now. To the crowd gathering around her, she had already become a spectacle. "I already told you," Naomi said softly, trying to steady her breathing. "I didn't steal anything." Ryan let out a sharp laugh and glanced toward the younger officer beside him. Funny how that's always the first thing people say. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from nearby onlookers. Someone in the crowd whispered, "What did she do?" Another voice answered before anyone actually knew. "Probably shoplifting." Naomi closed her eyes for half a second as cameras continued recording her from every angle. The plaza's giant digital billboard reflected flashes of blue and red lights across the wet pavement, while the sound of distant traffic blended with murmurs from the growing crowd. It should have been a normal Thursday afternoon. Instead, her humiliation was becoming public entertainment. Ryan nudged her purse with the tip of his boot, and papers scattered farther across the sidewalk. A family photo slid near the curb before stopping beside someone's sneaker. Naomi's jaw tightened when she saw it. "Please," she said quietly. "Those are personal." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before causing trouble," Ryan snapped. The younger officer, Daniel Brooks, shifted uneasily beside him. He looked at Naomi, then at the people filming, and something about the entire situation clearly bothered him. But he stayed silent. Most people did. A little girl standing beside her mother tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mom," she whispered innocently. "Why are they being mean to her?" The mother immediately pulled her away without answering. Ryan crouched slightly and grabbed Naomi's wrist harder than necessary as he inspected a small silver access card that had fallen from her purse. His eyes narrowed. Well, he muttered loudly. "Looks like we got ourselves a fake federal ID too." A few people gasped. Naomi's expression changed for the first time. Not fear, not panic. Something else. Something colder. "Officer," she said carefully, locking eyes with him for the first time, "you're making a very serious mistake." Ryan smirked. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Around them, phones continued recording. Hundreds of eyes stayed fixed on the woman kneeling in the middle of the plaza while sirens echoed faintly somewhere in the distance. But Naomi didn't look defeated anymore. She looked patient. And somewhere beyond the crowd, just past the line of parked cars, 3 black SUVs quietly turned onto the street. The sound of approaching engines rolled softly through the plaza at first, almost unnoticed beneath the whispers of the crowd and the constant clicking of phone cameras recording Naomi Carter on the cold concrete beside the fountain. Officer Ryan Keller still held the silver access card loosely in his hand, turning it back and forth with a mocking grin stretched across his face. "You expect people to believe this?" he asked loudly. "Federal access clearance? Come on." Naomi slowly rose from her knees after Ryan finally released her wrist, her coat slightly wrinkled and her purse still scattered across the sidewalk. She bent down calmly to gather the papers one by one, while dozens of strangers watched her in silence. The humiliation hung in the air heavier than the chilly November wind moving through downtown Baltimore. Some people looked uncomfortable now. Others kept recording because deep down they sensed something was shifting. Naomi picked up the framed family photograph Ryan had kicked near the curb. For a brief second, her fingers lingered over the picture. A younger version of herself stood beside an older man wearing a dark suit and an American flag pin on his lapel. Ryan noticed it immediately. "What is that?" he scoffed. "Your lawyer." Naomi slipped the photograph quietly back into her purse without answering. That silence irritated him more than anger would have. "I asked you a question," Ryan snapped. Daniel Brooks shifted nervously beside him again. He glanced toward the end of the street where the black SUVs had stopped near the corner. Something about them made his stomach tighten. Their windows were tinted dark, and none of the vehicles carried police markings. Naomi noticed them too, but her expression never changed. She simply stood there with quiet composure while the flashing patrol lights reflected against the glass buildings surrounding the plaza. "Officer Keller," Daniel said carefully under his breath. "Maybe we should slow this down until we verify the identification." Ryan looked at him with immediate annoyance. "Verify what? You think this is real?" He raised the silver card higher so the crowd could see it. "People fake this stuff all the time." A man near the front of the crowd muttered, "This is getting out of hand." Another voice answered, "No kidding." The energy around the plaza had started changing. Earlier there had been curiosity, even judgment. Now there was tension, uneasy tension, the kind that spreads when people realize they may have watched something they should have stopped. Naomi finally looked directly at Daniel instead of Ryan. "You still have time to do the right thing," she said softly. Her calm voice cut through the noise more sharply than yelling ever could. Ryan laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Save the speeches." Then one of the SUV doors opened. Every conversation in the plaza seemed to stop at once. Two men in dark suits stepped onto the sidewalk with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. They moved quickly but calmly through the crowd, scanning the scene with focused expressions. Behind them came a woman with an earpiece and a long gray coat, her eyes locking onto Naomi almost instantly. Daniel felt his pulse spike. Ryan's confidence wavered for the first time. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The woman ignored him completely as she approached Naomi. "Ms. Carter," she said firmly, "are you all right?" The entire plaza went silent. Ryan blinked in confusion. "Wait," he said, stepping forward. "Who exactly are you people?" The woman finally turned toward him, her expression cold and unreadable. Then she reached into her coat and revealed a federal badge. "Special Agent Vanessa Reed," she said. "Department of Civil Rights Oversight." Ryan's face slowly lost color while cameras continued recording every second. And standing behind Agent Reed, stepping out from the final SUV with controlled calm written across his face, was the man from Naomi's photograph. The man stepping out of the final black SUV did not raise his voice or rush forward. Yet somehow the entire atmosphere of the plaza shifted around him the moment his polished shoes touched the sidewalk. Conversations faded. Phones slowly lowered. Even the distant sound of traffic seemed quieter beneath the weight of sudden uncertainty spreading through the crowd. He was tall, composed, and carried the kind of presence built from years of authority that never needed to announce itself. A dark charcoal overcoat rested neatly over his broad shoulders, and silver streaks lined the edges of his closely trimmed beard. Officer Daniel Brooks recognized him almost instantly from federal briefings he had seen during academy training. His chest tightened. "Oh my God," Daniel whispered under his breath. Ryan Keller looked confused at first, then irritated. "What now?" he muttered, still gripping Naomi's silver access card like he refused to let go of control. The older man walked directly toward Naomi without acknowledging the crowd or cameras surrounding them. When he finally stopped beside her, his expression softened for the first time. "Naomi," he said calmly, "are you hurt?" Naomi shook her head slowly. "I am fine." But the exhaustion in her voice told a different story. The man looked down briefly at the papers scattered near the fountain, then at the redness around Naomi's wrist where Ryan had grabbed her earlier. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Who are you supposed to be?" Ryan demanded, trying to recover his confidence. The man turned toward him fully now. For a brief second, Ryan seemed smaller somehow, like the authority he wore so comfortably minutes ago had suddenly become fragile. "Deputy Director Marcus Carter," the man said evenly. "Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Division." Silence crashed over the plaza. Several people in the crowd gasped quietly. Someone near the back whispered, "That is her father?" Another voice answered, "No way." Ryan's face drained of color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the flashing patrol lights. Daniel immediately stepped backward, instinctively creating distance between himself and the situation unfolding in front of him. Ryan forced a nervous laugh that convinced no one. "Look, sir, we were responding to suspicious behavior. We had reason to investigate." Marcus Carter stared at him without emotion. "Suspicious behavior," he repeated softly. Ryan swallowed hard. There was a report. Marcus nodded once. Interesting. He slowly reached into his coat pocket and removed a small leather case before opening it toward Ryan. Inside was a federal identification badge carrying a level of clearance high enough to make Daniel's pulse spike again. Then perhaps, Marcus continued calmly, you can explain why your officers publicly detained a federal investigator in the middle of an active oversight operation. The words hit the plaza harder than shouting ever could. Naomi remained silent beside her father while cameras captured every expression on Ryan's face in painful detail. Operation, Ryan repeated weakly. Agent Vanessa Reed stepped forward, holding a digital tablet in one hand. For the last 8 months, she said, Ms. Carter has been assisting an ongoing investigation involving discriminatory policing practices, unlawful detainment patterns, and abuse of authority within this district. Ryan blinked rapidly as realization finally began sinking in. No, he said quietly, almost to himself. No, that is not possible. Naomi finally looked directly at him again. Her voice stayed calm, but there was something devastating in its steadiness. You never stopped to ask who I was, she said. You already decided what I deserved the moment you saw me. Around them, the crowd had completely changed now. Earlier there had been judgment and curiosity. Now there was shame. People who once watched silently suddenly looked away from Naomi's face, uncomfortable with their own silence moments before. Then Agent Reed spoke again. Officer Keller, she said firmly, you are going to hand me that access card now. Ryan looked down at the silver card, trembling slightly in his hand as the sound of more approaching sirens echoed through the city streets. Ryan Keller stared at the silver access card in his hand as though it had suddenly become something dangerous. Only minutes earlier he had waved it around in front of strangers with mocking confidence, treating it like a cheap fake from the internet. Now his fingers tightened around it uncertainly while the entire plaza watched him unravel in real time. The flashing red and blue patrol lights reflected across the polished federal SUVs parked along the curb, turning the downtown square into a scene nobody there would forget. Agent Vanessa Reed extended her hand calmly. The card, Officer Keller. Ryan hesitated for half a second too long before finally handing it over. The movement was stiff and awkward, stripped of the swagger he carried earlier. Naomi Carter quietly adjusted the sleeve of her navy coat, while cold wind swept through the plaza again, carrying the distant smell of rain and traffic from the harbor. She looked emotionally exhausted now, but her posture remained steady, dignified, controlled. That calmness unsettled Ryan more than anger ever could have. This whole thing has been a misunderstanding, he said quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. Nobody knew she was federal. Marcus Carter slowly turned toward him. That is the problem, he said quietly. You believed respect depended on knowing her title first. The words landed heavily over the crowd. Several people lowered their phones slightly, uncomfortable with how true it sounded. Daniel Brooks looked down at the pavement, unable to meet Naomi's eyes anymore. He kept replaying the scene in his head. The accusations, the public embarrassment, the laughter from strangers, and worst of all, his own silence while it happened. Across the plaza, more marked vehicles arrived, but these were not local patrol units. Dark blue sedans with internal affairs markings pulled up behind the federal SUVs, while suited investigators stepped onto the sidewalk carrying folders and tablets. Ryan noticed them immediately, and his breathing changed. Wait, he said nervously. Internal affairs? For what? Agent Reed looked at him evenly. Because this incident did not happen in isolation. Ryan shook his head quickly. No, you cannot pin this on me like I am some racist cop just because I responded to a call. Naomi finally spoke again, her voice calm but carrying through the silent plaza with startling clarity. Nobody forced you to humiliate me publicly, she said. Nobody forced you to ignore my identification. Nobody forced you to treat me like I did not belong here. Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The crowd had changed sides completely now. Earlier, people watched Naomi with suspicion because a uniform told them to. Now they watched Ryan the same way. A middle-aged man near the fountain quietly muttered. She warned him. Another person answered, and he kept going. Daniel swallowed hard and stepped toward Marcus Carter carefully. Sir, he said quietly, for what it is worth, I should have stepped in sooner. Marcus studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Sometimes courage arrives late, he replied. But late is still better than never. Ryan looked around desperately as more investigators approached. The plaza that once made him feel powerful now felt impossibly small. Every camera pointed toward him. Every whisper sounded sharper. He could practically feel the internet already spreading clips of the confrontation across thousands of screens. Agent Reed opened her tablet and turned it toward Ryan. "We have already received body camera uploads from the responding units," she said, "and over 60 civilian recordings from witnesses at this scene." Ryan's face tightened. "People edited videos all the time." "That would be more convincing," Reed answered coldly, "if your own audio did not match perfectly." Naomi looked away from Ryan then, toward the city skyline glowing beneath the gray November clouds. For the first time since the ordeal began, her breathing finally slowed. But somewhere deep in the growing silence around the plaza, another realization was beginning to spread. This was never just about one humiliating encounter. This was about a system that had finally been caught in public. Rain finally began falling over downtown Baltimore in soft, cold drops that shimmered beneath the flashing emergency lights surrounding the plaza. Nobody moved to leave anymore. The crowd remained frozen in place as though they understood they were witnessing something larger than a routine police stop. Phone cameras continued recording from every angle, while reporters from nearby stations started arriving after social media clips spread across the city within minutes. Naomi Carter stood quietly near the marble fountain, her hands folded calmly in front of her while investigators moved around the scene collecting statements and securing footage. Earlier, she had looked alone. Now the entire atmosphere around her carried a different kind of gravity. Officer Ryan Keller felt it too. He kept glancing toward the growing line of federal vehicles parked along the curb while trying unsuccessfully to steady his breathing. The confidence that once shaped every word he spoke had completely disappeared. "I followed procedure," he insisted again, though his voice sounded weaker now. "You cannot destroy my career because of one misunderstanding." Marcus Carter looked at him carefully, the rain collecting along the shoulders of his dark overcoat. "Careers are not destroyed in a single moment," he said quietly. "They are revealed in one." Ryan opened his mouth to argue again, but stopped when another investigator approached Agent Vanessa Reed, carrying a tablet loaded with files. "We pulled prior complaints connected to Officer Keller," the investigator said. 8 formal reports in 3 years. Most involved unlawful stops or discriminatory conduct allegations. Ryan's face tightened immediately. "Those complaints went nowhere," he snapped. "Because they were false." Naomi looked at him silently for several seconds before speaking. "Or because nobody important was watching yet." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel Brooks felt his stomach twist hearing them, because deep down he knew she was right. He remembered conversations inside the precinct. Quiet jokes. Certain neighborhoods officers avoided respectfully, and others they treated like occupied territory. Things people normalized because challenging them carried consequences. Standing there now beneath the cold rain, Daniel realized how dangerous silence could become when enough people accepted it as normal. Across the plaza, several civilians who had recorded the confrontation earlier slowly approached federal agents offering to share their footage voluntarily. An elderly black man wearing a Baltimore Ravens jacket shook his head sadly while handing over his phone. "I've seen this happen too many times," he said quietly. Only difference tonight is she had somebody powerful standing behind her. Naomi overheard him, and her expression changed slightly. There was sadness in it now. Real sadness. Because she understood exactly what he meant. Most people never received federal protection. Most people never had cameras arrive in time. Most people simply carried the humiliation home alone. Agent Reed noticed Naomi staring toward the older man. "You okay?" she asked softly. Naomi nodded slowly, though her eyes remained distant. "I just keep thinking about how differently tonight could have ended." Marcus placed a gentle hand against his daughter's shoulder. "But it did not," he said firmly. "Because you stood your ground." Nearby, Ryan watched the interaction with growing desperation. "I am not racist," he suddenly blurted loudly, almost pleading now. Several people in the crowd exchanged uncomfortable looks. Marcus turned toward him carefully. "Racism is not always loud hatred," he replied. "Sometimes it is assumption. Sometimes it is humiliation. Sometimes it is deciding who deserves dignity before you even know their name." Rain continued falling steadily across the plaza while Ryan stood speechless beneath the flashing lights. Somewhere nearby, a church bell echoed faintly through the city streets, mixing with distant sirens and the quiet hum of cameras still recording every second. Then Agent Reed received a message through her earpiece. Her expression hardened immediately. "Deputy Director Carter," she said, "the commissioner just reviewed the footage." Marcus nodded once, and Reed looked directly toward Ryan. "Effective immediately, Officer Keller has been suspended pending federal review." The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm clouds hanging above the city. The moment Agent Vanessa Reed announced Ryan Keller's suspension, the entire plaza seemed to exhale at once. Some people lowered their phones slowly while others continued filming in stunned silence, unwilling to miss whatever came next. Rainwater glistened across the concrete sidewalks beneath the flashing emergency lights, turning the downtown square into a cold blur of reflections and shadows. Ryan stood frozen near the patrol car, his face pale and tight with disbelief. Only an hour earlier he had walked into the plaza convinced his badge made him untouchable. Now every eye around him carried judgment instead of admiration. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "You are treating me like some criminal." Agent Reed closed the tablet in her hands calmly. "Nobody said that," she replied evenly. "But accountability feels different when cameras are rolling." Those words lingered heavily in the air. Nearby, Daniel Brooks quietly removed his patrol cap, rain soaking into his short brown hair as he stared down at the pavement. The younger officer looked emotionally drained now, as though the entire night had forced him to confront things he had spent years avoiding inside himself. Naomi Carter noticed him standing there alone. Despite everything that had happened, her voice remained gentle when she finally spoke to him. "You still have a choice about the kind of officer you become." Daniel looked up slowly, surprised by her kindness after the humiliation she endured. "I should have stopped it sooner," he admitted quietly. Naomi nodded once. "Yes," she answered honestly. "You should have." Daniel swallowed hard, but did not argue because he knew she was right. Across the plaza, reporters had begun gathering near the police barricades while news vans lined the curb under the stormy Baltimore sky. Social media notifications exploded across phones throughout the crowd as clips of the confrontation spread online faster by the minute. Some headlines already appeared on nearby screens. Federal investigator publicly humiliated during police stop. Viral footage sparks internal investigation. Witnesses describe public abuse of authority. Ryan saw the headlines appearing on phones around him, and panic finally began replacing denial. "You cannot let the media spin this," he snapped toward Marcus Carter. "This is exactly how careers get ruined." Marcus looked at him steadily through the falling rain. "No, Officer Keller," he replied quietly. "Careers are ruined when power loses its humanity." The plaza fell silent again. Even the reporters nearby stopped talking for a moment after hearing those words. Naomi looked toward the growing crowd of strangers surrounding the scene. Earlier, many of them had watched her with suspicion simply because a uniform told them to. Now their expressions carried regret, shame, reflection. A young woman stepped forward carefully from the edge of the crowd, holding her phone tightly in trembling hands. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "I am sorry I did not say anything earlier." Naomi studied her face for a moment before offering a small, tired smile. "Most people stay silent because they are afraid," she replied. "The important thing is what you do after fear." The woman lowered her eyes, visibly emotional. Nearby, another federal investigator approached Marcus carrying a thick folder protected beneath a waterproof case. "Sir," the investigator said quietly, "we cross-referenced previous complaint records with tonight's footage. There is enough for expanded review." Ryan immediately looked up. "Expanded review?" His voice cracked slightly now. Agent Reed stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "This incident triggered a deeper audit into multiple unresolved complaints tied to your precinct." Ryan stared at her speechlessly while thunder rumbled faintly over the harbor in the distance. The weight of reality was finally settling onto his shoulders. This was no longer just one public mistake. The system he trusted to protect him had started turning its attention inward. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as rain continued falling against her coat. She felt exhausted down to her bones, but somewhere beneath the humiliation and emotional fatigue, something else quietly emerged. Relief. Because for once, the truth had not stayed hidden behind closed doors. The rain finally began to slow over downtown Baltimore, but the tension hanging across the plaza refused to fade. Red and blue lights continued flashing against the glass towers surrounding the square, while reporters spoke urgently into cameras only yards away from where Naomi Carter had been forced onto her knees less than an hour earlier. What started as public humiliation had now become a national story unfolding in real time. Ryan Keller stood beside his patrol car, looking completely disconnected from the confident officer he had been earlier that afternoon. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of dozens of staring eyes, and every few seconds he glanced toward the cameras surrounding him as though hoping they would somehow disappear. But they did not. The internet had already seen everything. Agent Vanessa Reed quietly reviewed new information arriving on her tablet, while federal investigators moved between witnesses gathering additional statements. Nearby, Daniel Brooks sat silently on the edge of a concrete planter with rainwater dripping from the brim of his cap. He looked emotionally shaken, replaying every moment of the incident over and over inside his head. Naomi noticed him staring blankly toward the street and slowly walked over. "You okay?" she asked softly. Daniel let out a bitter breath. "Honestly, no." He looked up at her, guilt written all over his face. "I joined the department because I wanted to help people. Somewhere along the line, I started convincing myself silence was part of survival." Naomi listened quietly. "A lot of good people stay silent until it is too late," she replied. "That is how bad systems survive for so long." Daniel lowered his eyes again because deep down he knew she was right. Across the plaza, Marcus Carter stood speaking with city officials who had suddenly arrived in expensive coats and polished shoes after the footage went viral. Their nervous smiles and careful words felt hollow compared to the raw humiliation Naomi endured earlier in front of the same crowd, now surrounding her with sympathy. One of the officials glanced toward the cameras uneasily before speaking in a lowered voice. "Deputy Director Carter, the mayor's office wants to issue a statement immediately." Marcus looked at him calmly. "A statement is not accountability." The official swallowed awkwardly and stepped back. Nearby, Ryan overheard the conversation and his panic deepened further. For the first time in years, he realized his badge could not protect him from public truth. "This whole thing is turning into a circus," he muttered angrily. Agent Reed looked directly at him. "No," she answered. "It became accountability the moment people stopped looking away." Ryan shook his head in frustration. "You act like I ruined her life." Naomi turned slowly toward him then. Her expression remained calm, but there was pain behind her eyes now that cameras could not fully capture. "Maybe not my life," she said quietly, "but you tried to ruin my dignity." Those words silenced the plaza all over again. Even the reporters nearby stopped speaking for a moment. Ryan looked away first. The truth in her voice carried something heavier than anger. It carried exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone forced to prove their humanity over and over again just to receive basic respect. A few feet away, the elderly man in the Raven's jacket still stood watching everything unfold. He slowly shook his head and spoke softly enough that only nearby people could hear him. She handled this with more grace than most people would. Naomi heard him and offered a faint smile. "Grace is expensive," she replied quietly. "Sometimes people pay for it with years of pain." The old man nodded sadly because he understood exactly what she meant. Then suddenly another alert appeared across phones throughout the crowd. Major networks had picked up the story nationwide. Clips of Ryan humiliating Naomi publicly were now playing across television screens all over America. Ryan saw one of the headlines reflected in a nearby camera lens, and his face completely fell. "Federal investigator publicly targeted during viral police encounter." Standing beneath the fading rain and flashing lights, he finally understood something terrifying. The moment he thought nobody important was watching had become the moment the entire country did. By the time the rain finally stopped over downtown Baltimore, the plaza no longer felt like the same place where Naomi Carter had been publicly humiliated earlier that evening. The flashing lights still reflected across the wet pavement, but now the atmosphere carried something entirely different. Accountability. The crowd that once stood silent had grown larger, packed with reporters, investigators, city officials, and ordinary people who could not stop watching the story unfold before them. Giant news cameras pointed toward the scene while helicopters circled faintly overhead, their distant hum blending with the constant vibration of phone notifications spreading the footage across the country. Ryan Keller stood near the curb looking trapped inside a nightmare he could not wake up from. Every few seconds, another person recognized his face from viral clips already flooding social media. The same officer who mocked Naomi in front of strangers was now being watched by millions. Agent Vanessa Reed quietly finished another call before walking toward Marcus Carter with a serious expression. "We just received confirmation from Washington," she said. "The department has authorized a full federal review of the precinct effective immediately." Several nearby reporters overheard the statement and immediately began speaking excitedly into microphones. Ryan looked stunned. "A full review?" he repeated weakly. "Over one incident." Marcus looked directly at him. "People rarely investigate the first complaint," he said calmly. "They investigate the pattern hiding behind it." Ryan's face tightened because somewhere deep down he already knew there had been a pattern. Complaints ignored. People dismissed. Assumptions made too quickly. Situations escalated because certain faces looked suspicious before a single word was spoken. He had spent years convincing himself it was simply part of policing. Standing there now beneath national cameras, that excuse sounded emptier than ever. Naomi stood quietly beside the fountain, exhaustion visible in every movement now. The emotional weight of the night had settled deeply into her expression, but there was still dignity in the way she carried herself. One young reporter approached cautiously, holding a microphone with trembling hands. "Miss Carter," she asked softly, "how did you remain so calm through all of this?" Naomi looked at the growing crowd surrounding the plaza before answering. "Because anger would have made people focus on my reaction instead of their actions." The crowd fell silent again after hearing those words. Nearby, Daniel Brooks listened carefully, feeling every sentence hit harder than the last. He stepped closer slowly. "She is right," he admitted quietly toward the investigators nearby. This was never treated like a normal stop. Ryan looked sharply toward him in disbelief. "Daniel." The younger officer met his stare for the first time all night without backing down. "We all saw it." Ryan looked away immediately. The truth was becoming impossible to outrun now. Across the plaza, city officials who once moved confidently through cameras and public events now looked visibly nervous, while federal investigators entered the precinct building across the street, carrying boxes and evidence cases. Some officers inside the station watched through windows uncertainly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The system itself suddenly seemed unstable, like cracks hidden for years had finally become visible under enough light. An elderly woman standing near the crowd slowly approached Naomi with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered softly. Naomi looked surprised. "For what?" The woman smiled sadly. "For surviving this with your head held high. Some of us never got that chance." Naomi's eyes softened immediately. She reached forward and gently squeezed the woman's hand, without saying anything else because there were no words large enough for that kind of pain. Nearby, Ryan watched the exchange quietly while the reality around him collapsed piece by piece. He thought authority came from a badge, from fear, from control. But standing there surrounded by cameras, investigators, and witnesses, he finally understood something too late. Real power was never about humiliation. Real power was the ability to hold on to your humanity even after someone tried to take it from you. Hours later, the storm clouds had finally drifted away from downtown Baltimore, leaving behind streets that glistened beneath the city lights like polished glass. The crowd around the plaza had slowly begun thinning out, but the energy of what happened there still lingered heavily in the cold night air. News crews packed equipment into vans while federal investigators continued moving in and out of the precinct building across the street, carrying boxes of files and evidence. The city that once ignored quiet complaints was suddenly being forced to look directly at them. Naomi Carter stood near the fountain one last time, staring at the ripples moving gently across the dark water. Her navy coat was still damp from the rain, and exhaustion rested visibly across her face now that the adrenaline of the night had faded. She looked emotionally drained in a way cameras could never fully capture. Marcus Carter approached quietly beside her, slipping his hands into the pockets of his overcoat. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. They simply stood together listening to the distant sounds of traffic and helicopter blades fading somewhere over the harbor. "You did good tonight," Marcus finally said softly. Naomi let out a tired breath. It should not take federal badges and viral videos for people to be treated like human beings. Marcus nodded slowly because there was no honest argument against that truth. Nearby, Daniel Brooks stood beside his patrol car, watching the scene unfold quietly. Earlier that evening, he wore the same uniform as Ryan Keller, but now the fabric felt heavier somehow. Like responsibility finally carried weight again. He walked toward Naomi carefully, uncertainty written all over his face. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I do not expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know something." Naomi turned toward him calmly. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. "Tonight changed the way I see this job. Maybe even myself." Naomi studied him for a moment before answering. "Then make sure it changes the way you treat people too." Daniel nodded immediately. "It will." Across the plaza, Ryan Keller sat alone inside the back of an unmarked city vehicle waiting for transportation downtown. No handcuffs. No dramatic scene. Just silence. The same silence he once expected other people to endure quietly. His uniform still carried the badge he had trusted for years, but now it looked smaller somehow beneath the harsh parking lot lights. Through the window, he watched Naomi speaking calmly with investigators and civilians who approached her with sympathy and gratitude. Earlier, he had looked at her and seen suspicion before humanity. Now, for the first time, he saw the damage that kind of thinking could create. Not just for her, but for everyone around it. Agent Vanessa Reed approached Naomi holding a folder beneath her arm. "The commissioner issued a formal statement," she said. "There will be a federal oversight task force assigned to the department immediately." Naomi nodded quietly, but did not smile. "Good," she answered softly. "Maybe somebody else will not have to go through this." A faint wind moved through the plaza again, carrying the smell of rain and cold concrete, while the final reporters wrapped up their broadcasts nearby. The giant digital billboard overlooking downtown now displayed a simple headline glowing across the night sky. "Calls for reform grow after viral police incident." Naomi stared at the words silently. She never wanted to become a symbol. She never wanted cameras or headlines or public sympathy. She simply wanted dignity before anyone knew her title. Marcus placed a gentle hand against her shoulder. "Ready to go home?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked around the plaza one last time. The same place where strangers watched her humiliation had become the place where truth finally forced people to confront themselves. Slowly, she nodded. As father and daughter walked toward the waiting black SUV, the city lights reflected softly against the wet pavement behind them. And somewhere in the silence left behind after the cameras faded and the crowds disappeared, one truth remained impossible to ignore. A badge can give someone authority, but only character determines what they do with it.